So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, for this session on behalf of Swiss Sustainable Finance and on behalf of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment that will address, I think, important topics that are very complementary to what you've been hearing already for more than a day from a different angle. At this session, we will, by the way, officially launch the Swiss Consultation Group on TNFD. Sees that Building Bridges is playing really its role by making sure that if something has to take place, it is here that it takes place, or at least it is being announced. So I'm really grateful that this initiative can now be reality here during Building Bridges. We are all directly, as you know, affected by biodiversity crisis, and our different ecosystems supply us with not only food, but also raw material, energy, but only so if they remain intact. And as you know, the threat is that they won't. Loss of biodiversity, therefore, threatens not only our livelihood, but also poses major problems and risks for business. Companies do not have the necessary information to fully understand how the loss of biodiversity can impact their business, and the resulting financial risks over the long term for them is really difficult to assess. So financial institutions, on their side, lack the suitable data and instruments. This is a criticism that we've heard for a long time, to enable us or them to effectively incorporate the nature-related risks and opportunities into our or their strategic planning and risk management, although the intuition, of course, is that there's huge, nearly unlimited potential about it. The financial industry can only evaluate the associated risks if they have meaningful and comparable information available to them on the businesses they finance. So the role here, again, of Building Bridges is important, because it's not a matter of the financial sector itself, but it's a matter of really every stakeholder providing its contribution to solving this equation. TNFD addresses this gap by defining ways to report about nature risk for companies of all sectors. And by setting up the Swiss TNFD Consultation Group, Swiss Sustainable Finance and the UN Global Compact Network, Switzerland and Liechtenstein, are aiming to raise awareness on the topic and TNFD as a standard within the Swiss economy. The cooperation between finance and the real economy is key, not only in addressing the biodiversity crisis, of course, but also in the many other challenges we face. And so we are very happy that through the partnership between SSF and the Global Compact, we can establish a consultation group that reaches out to both players of finance and all other sectors. For SSF, it is clear we can only achieve global goals if we all team up. You've heard that many times during the whole summit and also during the week. The regulators, by setting the right frameworks, companies by committing to clear targets and providing transparency on progresses, finance by taking sustainability factors into account in all financing and investment decisions, and last but not least, consumers, of course, by adapting, adjusting, or changing their behavior. I would now like to get deeper into the matter and hand over to Christoph Baumann, who is the Envoy for Sustainable Finance of the State Secretariat for International Finance, the SIF, that jointly with BAFU supported the TNFD in its establishment. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first express my deep appreciation for being invited to hold the welcoming remarks for this wonderful event. Switzerland is the world's largest center for cross-border wealth management. It has a strong insurance sector that covers global risks and can actively represent shareholder interests together with pension funds and other major investors. The Swiss Financial Center can play a key supporting role in achieving sustainability goals, in particular, the transition to net zero and nature positive. In order for the financial institution to optimally support the achievement of the sustainability goals and to take into account appropriately sustainability risks, they require sustainability data from the economy as a whole. The more comparable, more accurate, and more meaningful this data is, the better they can be taken into account in advisory processes, their balance sheets, and in the financial system as a whole, and to lower the transaction costs for international and national investors. Whilst in the area of climate, we are already well on the way with the establishment of the TCFD recommendation and the recent establishment of the ISSB, other sustainability fields are still nascent. This is not true anymore for nature and biodiversity. The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, led by the private sector, is currently working with NGOs to develop a framework for disclosures on biodiversity risks and impacts. Formally, this is closely based on TCFD recommendations. The Federal Council is closely following this work and welcoming the creation of internationally comparable, meaningful transparency on nature and biodiversity. Switzerland is pushing for the TNFD work, analogous to the TCFD recommendations, to become the basis for future ISSB reporting standards in the area of biodiversity. We have supported the TNFD since its inception, actually before that already, and are part of the Stewardship Council along with UK and many other countries. Swiss companies, as mentioned by Patrick, are actively involved in the task force, and as one of the first locations in the world, Switzerland established the so-called National Consultation Group, today, as we heard, headed by the Swiss Sustainable Finance and Global Compact Network of Switzerland and Liechtenstein. I would like to thank everyone that is working so hard in making Switzerland a leader in the area of nature finance. Particularly, I would like to thank the key role played by Swiss Sustainable Finance. With this, I'm looking forward to an engaging discussions and hand over to Sabine Döbli.
Thank you, Christoph. And I have the pleasure to guide you to the rest of this event. And it is my great pleasure to already, wrong presentation again, but never mind. We do need the other presentation by the World Business Council, please, but let me first give my brief introduction. What we try to do today in this session is drilling down a bit on yet another acronym, TNFD. What does it really mean for those companies that have to report? What does it mean for financial service providers that use the data to really assess the risks and try and influence their business decisions? But before we do that, we really want to hear, why are we doing this? And I'm so pleased to have our first speaker here today, Nadine McCormick. She's Manager Nature Action at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But previously, Nadine, you've worked for the IUCN for many years. You're therefore the perfect person to tell us how urgently we need to tackle the topic of biodiversity. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Sabine. Good afternoon. That was rubbish. Good afternoon. Thank you. This is so nice to be here in person, isn't it? Like, wow, I haven't done a presentation in person for a long time. I don't have my notes in front of me on my screen here, so let's see how it goes. My name is Nadine McCormick with the World Business Council, Sustainable Development. And yeah, actually, the team said to me, can you just start with giving us a sense of, what is nature? And, how it links to biodiversity, because we've been having conversations and we know that not everybody gets it. And I've been having a lunch conversation. Somebody's like, yeah, but when I think of nature, it's like the Amazon in Brazil, right? That's nothing to do with me and what I do. So what I'm going to go through, my objective is to go back to the beginning. What is nature? How does it link to biodiversity? What are the risks that we're facing? And what are the immediate actions we need to take now while we have the frameworks that are under development, like TNFD and the other one, the Science-Based Targets Network. And I think, I urge you to embrace the complexity of nature. There's such a push in the finance community. We just want one metric. It's not the right question. But we can embrace the complexity of nature. And when you do that, you realize actually that what you're doing, what your clients are doing, actually are already starting to address and help us get to a more nature-positive world if we embrace that. So we're going to play a little bit like bingo. I'm going to be saying some key words, and you can be like, oh yeah, I can see now where that fits in to get us to a more nature-positive world, and then give you a sense of what you can do afterwards. I can't really come here and not just give a quick, who is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development? 200 of the leading of corporate and financial institutions working together to get a more sustainable world so that we can fully contribute to a net positive, nature positive, more equitable future. I sit in Nature Action, and I'm working with companies and colleagues every day, helping them understand nature and how that shows up in different sectoral pathways. So food and ag, forest, built environment, energy, they're the key ones we're doing at the moment. And then feeding that into TNFD through our piloting process and SBTN. So I talk about nature a lot and I have to go back to the beginning. So breaking down the complexity, I forgot to start my timer, sorry Sabine. I'll start it now. So what are we talking about and why? All right, I really want you, I'm going to stop speaking for 10 seconds. Oops, go back. What does nature mean for you? Think of some keywords in your head. We're going to play bingo now. I'm going to be saying some of the keywords I think you're thinking about. And as you're thinking about that, would you have the confidence and the courage to be able to talk to your boss or your client about nature and the risks of nature? Actually, why don't we do this? We're in person. Raise your hand if you feel confident right now. Yeah, I think I could talk to nature, to my boss, to my clients. That's really cool. That's about half of you. Really cool. All right, the other half, you need to up your game because everybody needs this basic understanding of how to speak about nature. So, what is nature? Really, as a starting point, it's life on our planet. It's the living entities that come together with our geology, with our freshwater, with our climate, and it comes together and it gives us a space where all species, and by the way, that's humans too, can thrive together. There's some more formal definitions. We like to draw TNFD. We're also drawing on what comes out of IPBES, and which is the IPCC equivalent, and the CBD. But it's really, think about this. So now we're getting into, it's the living entity. Sometimes that's biotic. And they interact with non-living entities. That's abiotic. That's like fresh water and rocks. And then it's the processes that are generated in that interaction. But you see, it's complex. It all connects together. The conservation community, the Science-Based Targets Network, they break it down into realms. And so you can think about it. Fresh water, I get that. That's lakes and rivers. And land-based, that's forests and grasslands and oceans. And there's a dotted line in the middle there because then you've got wetlands where land and freshwater cross over. And within that, your biodiversity is cross-cutting. It's a characteristic of what healthy nature looks like. And so let's think of land. Let's think of soil. If you've got high biodiversity levels, you've got really healthy, nutritious soil that leads to high crop yields and supports communities and business and supply chains. Soil without high levels of biodiversity, then we call it dirt. And so really, biodiversity is this characteristic. So one thing, nature does not equal biodiversity, but we can embrace biodiversity as an indicator of healthy nature systems. So this next kind of key message that you should be conveying with your clients that you're speaking to is all businesses impact on nature. You're going to get companies go, actually, we're a chemicals company. Nature, we don't impact on nature. And I'm not joking. I actually get some member companies who aren't on their journey yet thinking that. The way of thinking about it is actually, it's not direct operations, it's indirect too. Let's think scope 3. Scope 3 value chains, supply chain, consumption end. All of those aspects have 5 main drivers or pressures. Now, this is where it gets confusing because there isn't alignment. TNFD calls them drivers, SBTN calls them pressures, but there's 5 that you need to be aware of, and you can learn these off by heart. So this is land sea use change. You see them at the bottom of the graph on the left. So that's like deforestation. Resource exploitation, that means how much fresh water are you using? How much biomass are you using? Climate change, you will know about that already, greenhouse gas emissions. The pollution can also be in air, water, soil. typically linked to plastics, nitrogen, phosphorus, linked to pesticides, fertilizers. They're embedded in the global biodiversity framework, by the way. And then invasive species as well. So actually, these 5 main drivers you can learn off by heart. This is your entry point. What are your impacts on nature? Well, what are these pressures that you're causing here? Because those pressures are leading to the loss of state of nature. So state of nature is like, this is where species come in ecosystems. So we know now of ecosystems, we know that pretty much half of ecosystems worldwide are degraded. And then of course you've got more locally degraded or not. We know species of the 41,000 species that have been assessed, about a quarter of them are threatened. And when you look at amphibians, that's 41% of amphibians that are threatened with extinction. Conifers, 33%. So we can start breaking down the complexity and focusing on what's important. And then nature's contributions to people. What's that then? That's a rebranding of ecosystem services to be more inclusive of communities and indigenous peoples. But it's kind of the same thing. So yeah, there's lots of terminology out there, but you start to see how they fit together and how company activities are creating pressures which are then leading to changes in the state of nature. But companies on their own and finance institutions on their own are not wholly responsible for the state of nature, but they can provide data and feed into that. So who's responsible for measuring state of nature? That's governments, civil society. Business have a responsibility to reduce their pressures and reverse them. And so then the other key reason is that all businesses depend on nature. You're like, not really. I mean, not all sectors really depend on nature. I'm sorry, what air are your employees breathing? Sorry, what are they eating? What's that coffee they're drinking? Like, we all function and depend on nature. Actually, the World Economic Forum did some really great research on this. They looked at some 163 key sectors. Of those, within that, they've got 44 trillion, about half of the world's GDP is fully, highly or moderately dependent on nature. The other half is still dependent, but moderately or highly dependent on nature is really high. What are these services? You might have seen these before. Ecosystem services, that might ring a bell. The supporting services, it's about that soil formation. It's about photosynthesis. Provisioning, that's where the goods come from. Fresh water, biomass. Regulating, climate regulation. Climate comes up again. It's one of the pressures. It's also one of the functions. This is why climate and nature are so integrated. That's why we talk about it. Flood control, pollination, really we're getting into the nature-based services space. And that cultural part is also important. Yes, spirituality and indigenous peoples and communities, but also all of us, during that first lockdown, weren't we all craving to get into nature? Like, there is also cultural values that we all derive from nature. We are not just our job titles, we're human beings playing our place in the economy. So we all depend on nature to a greater or lesser extent. The World Economic Forum did some also really great research. They looked at these key sectors and dependencies, and it's probably no surprise at the top, both direct and supply chain, those land-based ones and ocean-based ones are there, forestry, agriculture, food and beverage. That's not surprising. Heat utilities, electricity, construction. That's why we're also focusing on energy supply chains and built environment, as well as land-based systems when we're doing our nature-positive roadmaps, because there's both risks and there's opportunities in that dependency space. I better speed up. So loads of reports are out there. Yes, we know that nature is embedded, the economy is embedded in the biosphere. It's not the other way around. The Sculptor Review tells us that. This nature loss is a bigger crisis than climate change, right? It's the next wave, the image that I didn't show. And so we need to deal with them together. This is not an additional, I'm already doing climate, I can't also do nature. It's one and the same thing. And climate, as a pressure on nature, is an entry point to think more broadly about nature. In the interest of time, I'm going to whiz over this one. You probably know it already. The World Economic Forum Global Risk Perception. 12 years ago, it wasn't there. Now it is. Breaking down risk. So if TNFD were here, they would say this. They break it down into physical risk, transition risk, systemic risk. This is the language of you finance institution people. I don't quite use that language. We talk about operational risk. Oh, I get that. So yeah, my factory got affected by flooding. We're not producing anymore. Not been able to source crops. because of degraded or wildfires. This is an operational risk, or you would call it acute risk and a chronic risk. This transition risk, more and more legislation is coming around deforestation, pollution sources, disclosure, the Global Biodiversity Framework trying to get carry on. There's more regulation coming. The market, consumers are choosing more sustainable products, and there's reputation not just with consumers, with finance institutions, and future employees. It's getting really hard to recruit right now. I don't know if you're experiencing that too. And then, of course, there's just this like existential risk, the systemic risk of, is our company going to exist in 10, 20, 50 years' time? What do we need to do now to transform our company? And I think the good news is that by being proactive on these, you can actually get to that opportunity space. And so, we've given feedback on TNFD, like how they present opportunities is not so. What they need to do is flip this. If you are proactive on your operational risks, for example, through resource efficiency, and by the way, circular economy approaches are really good for avoiding and reducing resource use, for example, you can actually then directly correlate them across. So market opportunities, financing opportunities, just hearing about some really great financial deals you can put in place if you've got more sustainable practices in your suppliers, so that's coming more and more. The reputation, again, with your communities and with your employees, and that future resilience. So it would be really nice if we could map one onto the other, but by being proactive about this and not reactive. Okay, so that was really your one-on-one, and now I've got 2 minutes left. Perfect. Tipping points. We're hitting tipping points. You cannot wait. And so some of you are like, I'll just wait for like TNFD to be finished, and I'll wait for the full methods of SBTN. Like, please don't wait. The planetary boundaries are already at tipping points. We're talking about bending the curve on the loss of nature. When we say bending the curve, it's trying to get this loss of biodiversity to stop, and we have to go back up. This is bending the curve, which is the origin of the global goal for nature. So nature positive was thrown around a lot today. I wasn't here yesterday, but today, oh yeah, nature positive, nature positive. What do we mean? Okay, the devil is in the detail, but what we're talking about is halting and reversing. Well, now let's come up with a number. Okay, net positive by 2030, full recovery by 2050. Yes, of course, we need a baseline. Yes, of course, how you're measuring, what are you measuring? But in short, intuitively, it's more nature in 2030 than we had in 2020. Like, your CEO can get that. The other key thing here is that it's a system level goal. And so there's a role for business and finance institutions and governments. We want business to assess, commit, transform. It means, assessing that whole big picture and prioritizing, not just direct operations, but also thinking value chain, scope 3. Its ambition is like halt and reverse, so you need your avoid and reduce targets. You also need your restore and regenerate targets, and then that mainstreaming. So we're saying to companies, what is your procurement doing? What are your investment doing? Getting it across your direct operations, and thinking value chain, and thinking landscapes. But a lot of companies haven't even started yet. So your job as finance institutions is not to ask, how many threatened species do you have in your operations? It's not the right question. Do you understand your impacts and dependencies on nature? We don't have any. Yes, you do. Take them to Encore. So chemicals, I'm picking on them, but a lot of chemicals companies think they've got nothing to do with nature. Go to the Encore tool, click in sector, subsector. What do we have here? Dependencies, there's 6 of those. Impacts, there's 7. It drills down, it tells you precisely what are they, what are the typical activities that cause those, and then that gives you a way of saying, do you have those activities? No, we don't do that. We do something else. We'll talk about that. So yes, KPIs, they'll come, but at least get that awareness stage. And then they can put in place actions to avoid, reduce, restore, and regenerate. I am flying. I'm so sorry. I knew I couldn't do it. Business has a role to play. Finance institutions, this is from the Capitals Coalition, the role of government. So what's your job? I love this guidance from Finance for Biodiversity. So they would say, yeah, you need to do that too. What are you investing in? Are you investing in built environment? Cool. They have impacts and dependencies too. Ask those questions then to the companies that you're financing, and think about what you're trying to do. Are you trying to manage your risks? Are you trying to put in place those positive solutions too? And then, yeah, engage proactively, because if you can increase your pressure along with civil society as well, that's how things are going to change in companies. So please ask the right questions. And then just as there's a reassurance slide here, there are so many initiatives out there. I love what the Capitals Coalition did here. They took that infinity loop and they started mapping. So the next acronym that you hear, you're like, which part of this loop are you addressing? And then you can see, for example, where TNFD fits in, as in that disclosure piece for financial institutions to feed back into what business is doing as well. So really just, this is a reassurance. Yes, we are aligning more and more. Embrace the complexity. Please don't wait for perfection. And yeah, just have an integrated approach. Don't see this as additional to climate. Climate was your entry point, actually, to a bigger process on nature. And I'm sorry, Sabine, I went over time, but thank you. Yeah.
Wow, Nadine, that was impressive. So much information in such a short period of time, and I'm sure you couldn't read as fast as she was going through the slides. So I'm sure you will make them available, and we can send them to, or have them available on our website if you want to dig deeper later. Thanks a lot, Nadine. Great insight into the challenge we have ahead. But now we want to get a bit more concrete, and I'm so pleased that I can now ask to the stage Judson Berkey. Actually, he was involved in setting up TNFD and specifically in defining the financial side of it and in defining the standards of how finance should adopt TNFD. So Judson, you're Head of Engagement and Regulatory Strategy at UBS, and you are a member of the task force, and you now tell us how you have set up the framework for the finance industry, but also give us the example of how UBS applies it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that introduction, Sabine, and thanks for the invitation today. I'm really actually very, very thankful for three things. First, I get to go after Nadine, so now you're absolutely experts on nature, and she really paved the groundwork for me. Second thing is, my daughter's favorite books at the moment, I have a 5-year-old daughter, her two favorite books at the moment are The Lorax and the Berenstain Bears Nature Guide. So when I had to go actually present to our board of directors last month on nature, I felt very well prepared. Seeing things through a child's eyes really emphasizes to you what is most important, how to explain things in simple, direct ways. And thirdly, I'm very, very thankful that I knew Sabina for quite a long time, because when Christoph called me one day and said, TNFD, what are we going to do in Switzerland? How about a consultation group? What do you think? Luckily, I was able to call Sabina and said, Sabina, help, please come. And thankfully, we were able to work out between her and Global Compact, helping Switzerland really get set up for a consultation group on TNFD. So what I want to do today is just kind of give you a little bit of sense of where the financial sector is in its thinking on the topic, where maybe UBS is even a little bit, but most importantly, where TNFD is, what it is, how it's developing, and essentially where it's going to next. So if I can manage all that in the 10 or so minutes I have, I think I've done very well. First, I don't want to repeat any of this because I think you saw it. A lot of it already. Actually, you saw the slide even early on, but you think heard about it even better from Nadine than me. But the one thing I did want to emphasize is just this concept of dependencies, the 44 trillion, the impacts, the 1.7 planets, so to speak, the risks, the WEF top 5, and then the opportunities, the 10.1 trillion. Because those four concepts are really very much integral to what we're trying to do within the TNFD. Ultimately, it is about the risks and opportunities, what that means for a business and its future value. That's what we want to understand from the finance sector. And more importantly, that's what companies in the primary sectors clearly want to understand. But that's informed by, absolutely, the impacts and dependencies. So now there can be lots of debates at times about materiality concepts, but I kind of want to get beyond the headlines and actually to the details. I think once you get into the details, it really is about understanding impacts, dependencies, and then how that informs your future risks and opportunities as a business and as an investor or a financial institution. Now, when I try and explain things internally, I do actually make this analogy back to climate, to absolutely what Nadine said. It's not just climate. Basically, the next is nature, and really it's in our way of thinking internally at UBS, following the climate playbook. I think all the component parts are falling into place that we've seen over the years. So certainly the disclosure bit's the bit I want to talk to you about today, TNFD like TCFD. But absolutely there are target setting mechanisms getting set up. There is collective stewardship activity amongst investors. There are financial regulators. You're trying to analyze systemic risk. But the one missing piece we still have is actually the big picture target. What is our Paris Agreement, or 1.5 for nature, so to speak? Now, maybe it won't be a single number, maybe it'll be multiple KPIs. But that hopefully is what is coming towards the end of this year with the Convention on Biological Diversity, the so-called COP15 meeting, which will now be held in Montreal in December. Hopefully that's where the 190 countries of the world do come together and really agree on what are some of the headline policy objectives for nature, because that, in our view, really will start to drive out very much how corporates evolve and how then the financial sector evolves. We've seen that on TCFD, and our view is that will repeat on the nature topic. So we did try and write on this earlier in the summer as UBS through our Sustainability and Impact Institute, which is a bit of an internal think tank, really to try and help our clients start to understand why nature, why is this coming now, why are people talking about it? And essentially, we did try and outline this thought process to them, the concept of planetary boundaries, a set of limits. I mean, limits are what we understand in the finance sector, so that concept clearly resonates with investors. But also this idea that it needs to be informed by science. We are not the experts. We need to draw from science and understand what those limits are, how they are expressed. We obviously need the governments to really provide some of the big picture guidelines and direction for this. Ultimately, it's going to come down to our clients, the non-financial corporates really trying to evolve their own strategies and their own processes, the same kind of transitions we're advising them on and working with them on climate. And then ultimately, we play our role, clearly, to help finance a lot of those transitions, as well as help make sure that we can sensitize people to the risks and the opportunities and really start to embed that into our own financial calculus. So certainly within the finance sector, I think a lot of people are starting to warm up to this and get it, honestly, and get it because they are moving towards it, or get it because they're being asked about it. We're starting to see more and more other of our stakeholders come along and start to ask us questions. Nature, what are you doing? How are you thinking about it internally? What are you doing with clients? We see regulators coming along and making rules already on it. For example, in France, the Dutch regulators have also been trying to do analysis on this. But most importantly, we start to see innovation in the actual financial sector. People trying to create products, create new offerings, develop sort of analytics around the nature topic. I think it's all early stage still, but rapidly evolving in, I think, a direct sign of some of the influence that's already been had in terms of raising the awareness around nature. So TNFD, what is it exactly? It is a task force of 34 corporations. Similar to the TCFD. Very, very pleased that the Swiss government is a large funder of it. Probably should actually be the number one, I think, but I don't know exact figures. But certainly in terms of spirit, they're number one in our view. And I think we're very, very lucky in Switzerland to have 4 of the 34 institutions, Swiss firms, Nestle, who's here today, Holcim, Swiss Re, and UBS. So very, very well represented. But I think it's also a sign of the role that Switzerland can play on this topic. We do have the global firms that really are very active on this topic. We do have essentially the understanding on broader environmental topics in Switzerland, even a bit the reputational asset to tap into in terms of people's view of Switzerland as clean and green and sensitized to these topics. So I really think there's a great opportunity here for Switzerland, the Swiss financial sector, the Swiss real economy, Switzerland more broadly, to really be a hub for nature and nature finance. But there are 2 things I think that distinguish a little bit TNFD from TCFD. One is it has a little bit broader ambitions in some ways. It's not just trying to do disclosure recommendations, it's also trying to support companies to get into the nature topic, capacity building. So there is the idea that it will provide some guidance on risk management activities. It will also help tease out some of the data offerings that are there. It'll maybe help advance on methodologies. The second thing that's a little bit different about TNFD, which I think comes out best on this slide, is it's working in a more iterative way. So it's going through multiple releases. It's in what's called a beta version for the moment. So there have been 2 releases to date, one in March of this year, one in June of this year, working towards a final set of recommendations September of next year, and there'll be 2 more releases in the interim. And I think that makes sense. I mean, TCFD was in some ways born into an open space, and so it had this ability to sort of define things and work over the years with its concepts. On the nature topic, there are a lot of other initiatives around. We saw some of them. I'll actually show a few more later on. So I think it makes sense that TNFD sort of works in a stepwise fashion. It also goes in a more iterative way to get feedback on what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Are we overcomplicating things? Are we oversimplifying things? Finding that balance for what's really going to be useful for corporations, what is useful for the financial sector. So what's come out to date are an initial set of draft recommendations on disclosures. some guidance around risk management, some information around data sources, and a little bit of initial views on where sectors may head. What is absolutely going to be critical, I think you'll have to watch out for in November. That's the next release, actually it's not October, it's now going to be early November. That's when we will come out with the first set of financial sector guidance. So I'm actually leading the financial sector working group within the TNFD, and we hope to put out some initial guidance. Again, with the view that it's a draft. I'm sure there'll be things that people disagree with, hopefully a few things people like, but I tell everyone in the TNFD, if people like it, it's all of our work. If they don't like it, it's absolutely my fault as the chair of this working group. So please feel free to take me up on that offer. But we're going to try and get something out that people can really react to and say, look, is this headed in the right direction? How we're thinking about metrics, does it make sense? The kind of additional guidance we provided beyond the initial disclosure recommendations, is it workable? Really try and get that feedback from the market to figure out where we go next. We have tried within TNFD to clarify some of the concepts. I think this was well mentioned by Nadine. This concept of what is natural capital? That's the asset base that we work with, like economic capital that we know. What are the ecosystem services? That's really the flows that we're trying to draw benefits from in our productive activity. What is biodiversity? Well, that's kind of this resilience factor, and if you have less of it, then obviously it makes everything harder. So really to try and get some of the basic definitional concepts right so that people can orientate their thinking. Also try to sort of explain a bit this idea of impact dependency leading to risk and opportunity. How does it then connect into firm value? Really illustrate some of the pathways. But ultimately, I think it does, in my view, really come down to the recommendations on disclosure. What do you want companies really to say? In our UBS view, reporting and transparency is never for its own sake. And transparency has really the absolute ability to transform. Once a company really has to put something out into the public domain, and to do it in a way that they're absolutely willing to stand behind it. It goes through their disclosure processes, their lawyers, their auditors, et cetera, that absolutely changes the focus inside a company and really can transform internally what's prioritized. And so our view is that such recommendations really have the power to do that if crafted well. So you may not be surprised, this looks remarkably like TCFD. I think we do have a little bit the view within TNFD that ultimately these disclosures can be combined. A lot of things will be the same. The governance is largely the same. We just have one board committee. We don't have a separate board committee for nature versus climate. It's always going to be one board committee, risk committee, a sustainability committee. The internal frameworks on the risk side will often be an integrated framework to deal with not just climate, but also broader interactions with nature. So a lot of those disclosures we think can be much one and the same and integrated. There will be differences, clearly, things around metrics, things around the location specifics for nature. So these are the initial disclosures that we have. So they're in the 4 TCFD pillars. The wording is in many cases very similar. What's highlighted in orange here are the things where essentially we're in a little bit of a parking place at the moment. We're still working on the ideas. What are the nature scenarios? Obviously, that would be greatly helped by having the policy objectives from governments. You can work back a bit from there, transition scenarios, risk scenarios. What are the targets? Obviously, the work going on in groups like SBTN will be very helpful with that. What are the metrics that we want to disclose? Again, we'll put out some first views of financial sector metrics in November. And the one thing that's been added is this emphasis on location. I think that the distinguishing factor on nature is not just what you do, like with carbon, but also where you do it, and how sensitive those areas are, what the impacts really are, what the dependencies deriving from those locations are. But clearly it's a balance here, how to disclose on location. Do you really try and disclose every activity in every single location down to a GPS coordinate, or do something more aggregate? Now I mentioned that there's lots of other groups supporting on the nature topic. So one thing we're very keen to do within the TNT is to crowd in good work going on elsewhere, and certainly in the finance sector, when it comes to risk management, there are, in my view, 4 key initiatives underway. There's the Finance for Biodiversity group that was mentioned before. It's a bit asset management focused. There's the UNEP FI Principles for Responsible Banking Biodiversity Community, which is a bit banking focused. There is a group called PBAF, the Platform for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, trying to work on sort of the same kind of concepts that PCAF did, very focused on the idea of footprint metrics. And then there's some very good work, more financial analysis oriented. How does this translate into credit risk, market risk, operational risk, going on at the Cambridge Institute? So I would encourage anyone who's just getting into these topics, you look at these 4 groups. We certainly don't have any intent or desire to repeat that work within the TNFD. We want to leverage that work, refer people to it. And then, very critically, back to my comment about Switzerland, there was just, I think, launched this week, nature finance, which in our view will be a critical component of building out Switzerland's expertise and competence on the matter, and really profiling Switzerland as a center of expertise and competence on the matter. We think there's great opportunity here for the Swiss financial center, the Swiss economy, really to be a center of expertise on the topic. So just quickly to finish, UBS, I think we are, like many of our big global peers, trying to embed this, integrate it, and we're trying to work on all fronts at the same time, and it's always a bit of a balance. So part of it is clearly about embedding into our own operational activities, our own operational footprint, and improving on that. I mean, just simple examples. We banned plastic basically a couple years ago for all of our internal consumption, our cafeterias, all of our meeting rooms, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it sounds small, but part of this is about activating people internally, getting them to realize what it's all about. And so having things at a personal level really can be quite impactful, while also trying to work more at the systemic level. Obviously, you're trying to educate our clients, as I mentioned before. We're trying to develop products. You're trying to work with various stakeholders, and you have regulators, governments, our suppliers, et cetera. So I think we're active on all fronts. I don't claim that we are the expert or the best at this, but certainly I think what it requires is really activating the whole firm, embedding into the firm, integrating within your climate work as well. So I will stop there. Hopefully I hit time, Sabina, and I will pass back to you.
Thank you so much, Judson, for these in-depth insights into what it actually means as a reporting company, but even more so to offer all these tools to the community. So I think lots to absorb even after this session. I now hand over to my colleague Veronica and Fabienne Sick from the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland to formally announce the launch and let you know what it is all about, this consultation group.
Hi, great to see so many of you here today. As Sabine mentioned, I'm Veronica Baker, and this is Fabienne, and we get the very exciting task. We are delighted to be launching the Swiss consultation group for the TNFD today. And yeah, as we heard from the previous two speakers, Nadine and Judson, the role of business in addressing nature loss is very clear and it's very vital. And it really is one of the biggest challenges for the coming decade. And we really want the interplay of the financial institutions and companies so that they can both incorporate nature-related risks and opportunities into their strategic planning, into their risk management, and also into their asset allocation. And a crucial thing that we really need for this is better information and better data. And this is what TNFD, as you've heard from the experts, is really hoping to do. So just to kind of fill in the small gap that was left from the other presentations, the TNFD has several entities that support it, one of which is the TNFD Forum, which is a consultative group of over 650 institutional supporters, and SSF is also one of them. It also has the TNFD Knowledge Partners, which are 16 leading scientific organizations and standard-setting bodies, and it has the TNFD consultation groups, which are informal groups convened in selected countries and regions to really expand its outreach and its engagement. And this is what SSF and UNGC are launching for Switzerland today. Then, in addition, it also has the TNFD Stewardship Council, which represents the founders and funders of the TNFD, and the TNFD Secretariat, who support all other activities. So, yeah, we are incredibly happy to be collaborating with UNGC today and to be building a bridge between our two institutions and also the kind of thing that we stand for. So, SSF represents its members from various sectors of the financial industry, and UNGC unites corporates from various sectors. And so, together, we can really represent both the financial industry and the real economy, which is really essential because the financial industry can only report properly when all the other various sectors provide reliable and accurate data in order for them to do so. And so, yes, this unifying aspect that we both have is really a desire to make sustainable business practices improved over the coming years. And so now, just in case you don't know SSF, Swiss Sustainable Finance, let me give you a brief overview of who we are. We were founded in 2014, and our central mission is to help the Swiss Financial Centre achieve a leading position in sustainable finance. And we do this through various activities, mainly 3 central activities. The first one being shaping best practice and informing about it. So one example that we have for that is the annual market study, which we publish every year. Also, we want to create supportive instruments and framework conditions. And one example for that are the reporting recommendations that we published last year. And finally, we want to cooperate with members and with other stakeholders. So one example for this is a publication from last year that we did with AMAS, the Asset Management Association Switzerland, on transparency and minimum requirements for financial investment approaches and products. And so, as you can see, there is a running thread through all of these activities that we have, which is a desire for transparency and really using our network that we have in order to get feedback and to create the kind of content that our members want to see and that we think would be useful for all of Switzerland. So this really serves us well in our role of being part of the TNFD consultation group. And you may be asking yourself, okay, well, who are these members who you represent? We have over 200 members. We have banks and asset managers, but we also have many other representatives from the financial industry, including insurance, pension funds, service providers, academia, and NGOs, and also the public sector. And now I'd like to hand over to Fabienne to tell you about UNGC.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Do you hear me well? Yeah? Thank you so much, Veronica, for this kind invitation to be here with you today and the Swiss Sustainable Finance team. Yeah, exactly. So before I turn to this, I actually, because this is building bridges and because I'm curious, I have a question to you. So please, with me, raise your hand if you are a representative of a financial institution. Great. And do we have any representatives from the other sectors, from the other private sectors here with us? Raise your hand. Okay, I see a few as well. And then do we also have some attendees from the public sector or from NGOs, academia, and other institutions? Amazing. So I see we have a very nice composition here to build bridges and to further strengthen these. So about the UN Global Compact and our Swiss and Liechtenstein local network, we are part of the largest corporate sustainability initiative with about 20,000 participants on a global level who, and we as the local network, we connect local businesses and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to drive sustainable business. So how are we doing this? We have these 10 universal principles in the areas of human and labor rights, environment, and anti-corruption. And our participants commit to implement these principles into their policies and procedures within their operations and across their value chain. And our work as a local network is to support these participants in their job to implement these 10 principles. And for this, we provide knowledge sharing and dialogue formats and learning opportunities, but we also, and we do this in the form of awareness raising, but also capacity building. And then we also provide them with tools and mutual exchange opportunities. So yeah, enough about us. I think it's really about the announcement, this exciting announcement of the Swiss TNFD consultation group. And I think we're all aware of the impact that we have on nature, and if we haven't been I mean, Nadine did a fantastic job in summarizing this, if I may say. Yeah, exactly. So, and because of this impact on the loss of biodiversity, we are aware of this, and this also has a huge impact on our livelihoods on a local, but also on a global level. But beyond this, it also poses a major risks to business. So, when we got approached by Swiss Sustainable Finance for this consultation group, it was a clear yes from our side to also participate in this group. And for you, so what is it really about, this group, right? So it is really about right now to build awareness about the TNFD's work, and by this also increasing the numbers of companies or organizations that pilot this framework and also provide feedback. So you see, and it has also already been mentioned by Judson, some of the members of this group here in Switzerland on a local level, which is UBS, Swiss Re, Holcim, and Nestle. And participation in this group really provides you with the opportunity to engage with the finance players, but also with the real economy, and to share your perspectives, to raise together with us the awareness about the framework and contribute to better align our lives with nature in the end. Oh, and then for all the activities that have already been organized and will come, I hand over back to you.
Yeah, so I don't want to take up too much time, but here's just an overview. We've already done some events in the past that centre the TNFD, and we plan to do more in the future. So if you want to hear more about that, just check our website.
Thanks to both my colleagues for formally launching this, and we look forward to the interaction with you and other parts of our network. We now come to the panel where we want to dig a bit deeper with not just the two presenters that we have, but also with Alison McCormick from Nestle, who is also involved in the TNFD group. So please join us here. Not Alison McCormick, Alison Bewick. Sorry for the confusion. And seeing that you're the only one that hasn't addressed our audience yet, I would like to give you the word first. I mean, from the speakers, we heard so much about all the information that companies should provide and the breadth of challenges that they face related to nature. But what does it mean for you in practice? And maybe you tell us first what your role is, how you try to promote this in Nestle, but how does a large company like Nestle, with 10,000s of suppliers, probably if you count them all, tackle this immense task? Please, Alison.
Hello, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, it's great to be here in person and also to meet my TNFD colleagues in person. And also it's great to be here for the announcement of the TNFD consultation group and the support of the Swiss government as well. Maybe I can share some perspectives, I guess, from a Nestle point of view, but clearly the approach that companies might take will depend on the sector and also the specific company. Maybe to start with, from a Nestle point of view, we depend on nature. Nature provides our raw agricultural materials. So for us, it's an absolute business imperative that we work to tackle nature loss, but also help and support to renew and restore nature. So I guess it's very, very complex, as Nadine simplified us for it, but it is complex, so where to start? And I think I'd actually echo what both Nadine and Judson had said, that to me, the starting point is around understanding your biggest impacts and your biggest dependencies. So really critical to, I think, to have quite a robust review of your value chain. So have some transparency around where you're sourcing, where you're producing, where do your final products and services and the waste of them end up. So I guess that in itself can be quite challenging. I do think from a Nestle point of view, the net zero roadmap that we embarked on 2 or 3 years ago, really drove a lot of focus around trying to improve the traceability and the transparency of our value chain. We still work towards that, but I think that's very, very important. And that can then help you as a company to say, okay, where can I make the biggest difference? And for Nestle, that is definitely in and around our supply chain and the communities where we work. So that's the where. What are we doing? We fundamentally believe that helping to shift to more regenerative practices and methods is absolutely critical, not just to tackle climate change, but also to really address nature loss, and then really help to drive to more nature positive outcomes as well. So we really are passionate about advancing regenerative agriculture, and we look at it through 3 pillars: improving soil health, restoring water cycles, and then improving and trying to increase biodiversity where we're operating in. So I guess how do we do that? And I guess 2 ways to sum that up would be it's very, very collaborative with our farmers, and it's incredibly local. So it's literally in the field with the farmer, trying to understand their local climatic conditions, the state of their soil, the crops, the broader ecosystem challenges. So it is, very much focused on pilots and proof of concept, as well as validating technologies and what works well there. Working out what's effective and then scaling that up. So expanding it to more farms, more regions, more countries, more crops, if that makes sense as well. So very much, we're learning, and we got to learn fast and fail fast, but really build on all of the collaboration with our farmers, with our suppliers as well. I would say that technology is definitely our friend here. So technology can help us with trying to, identify, right, what's our baseline, what's our starting point, and then what metrics, what data is going to help us to monitor progress. So we can identify, okay, that works really, really well, that's really effective, or it doesn't work so well there, why not? So really help us to learn on this journey as well. So I think, in summary, it's very much about starting around your biggest impacts and dependencies. To us, it's got to be a very, very collaborative process. I think no one organization or company can do this by themselves. So our farmers and suppliers are key, but also governments, expert foundations. We all have to learn to try and identify these, most effective solutions, and really strive to develop holistic nature-based solutions that help to address climate change, but also to help restore nature as well.
Very impressive to see how you can also build the bridge between the topic of climate and nature. And you mentioned the challenges in preparing data, but seen from the perspective of a financial service provider, you, Judson, mentioned this gap that is still there with regards to KPIs. What would be your future perspective of how this should work? Would you need a uniform set of nature KPIs on all the companies that you invest in to actually be able to report?
Yeah, I think this is the biggest challenge we have within the TNFD, is to figure out how to come to something that is meaningful but actually workable. And Nadine will probably not be happy with me, but in the ideal world, it would be a single number. And there are some proposals out there to create sort of so-called biodiversity footprints, a bit like carbon footprints. I think they're interesting as a concept. It would potentially give you a bit of a uniform currency across a range of companies. I think there are clearly challenges within them to make them actually right in terms of being specific to a company and its activities in a given location, and that's where maybe technology will be able to help us towards that. But I don't think we should put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. And I think that we're going to have one single number that we can key everything off of. It kind of is working for climate. It was CO2 emissions. So this is where my analogy to nature to following climate playbook probably starts to break down a bit. So how we're going to move forward on this effectively, I'm not quite sure yet, if I'm honest. But it's one thing we need to figure out within the TNFD. Because clearly it's going to differ by sectors at times. Of Nestle versus a Wholesome, you're worried about different kinds of issues, I think, at the end of the day. And you even need to think about the locations in which those activities are happening. And we in the finance sector are not necessarily going to be the experts to say what is the right number if you're looking at, say, I don't know, water withdrawal rates or pollution discharge rates. It's probably not zero in every case, like it is with carbon, where you really can target everything down to zero. So at some level, I think we're going to have to probably work sector by sector, figure out what's meaningful and material by the sectors, and in some sense be guided by what the companies think is most material to them and their future value. And what we're going to be interested in is that future value. What are the risks and opportunities they see, how their impacts and dependencies play out in terms of their own financial performance, and really figure out a way to have the companies explain in a clear and simple, understandable way their current situation, their future strategy, maybe against some kind of pathways or scenarios, and then ultimately what that means for them. And then that's information we can work with. But boiling it all down into one number that we can absolutely aggregate across every sector, every company, attached to a single portfolio, that would be ideal. And I think we should try, and maybe we will come up with some numbers, but I do think we shouldn't put all of our focus just on a single number.
I mean, even throughout this week, we heard of examples of approaches that try to condense everything into one figure with regards to biodiversity. So we'll see where the journey goes there. But maybe, Nadine, you impressively illustrated the whole receding biodiversity that we currently face. If you hear about all these activities now from large multinationals, but also from many innovative players preparing data, are you positive that we will manage to get this shift that you showed on this one slide? And just by the way, we have a Slido up and running, so feel free to type questions and I will see them and we can have a more interactive discussion.
So I think I'm naturally quite a positive person. So yes, I think my first part would be, I am positive. I've been working in this space of nature. Well, we used to call it biodiversity, actually. I used to be in the business and biodiversity program at IUCN. And so when it was biodiversity, there weren't that many companies that were interested. When we called it natural capital in 2015, 2016, there was an uptake. Now, nature and nature positive is really, it's called the imagination. There's a lot of energy around it. It's more accessible. There's one energy company that I work with that, she said, I was talking about biodiversity for, decades. Now I'm talking about nature. Like, there's an awareness. So awareness is the first step of change, right? The next step of change is willingness. So awareness, willingness. I'm still not. Then I'm flip-flopping. Now I'm not sure if the willingness is really there, let alone the readiness to start embarking on TNFD. I think, I don't know, if we think about our own communities where we live, I'm not seeing the changes on the ground happening fast enough. And I wonder, just collectively, we haven't talked about accountability, actually. That word hasn't come up yet. But I wonder if we need to be holding each other accountable to what's acceptable. Like, I'm being honest with you, we have some members who are saying to us, but nature isn't material. Like, your membership criteria, it shouldn't count for us. And I'm like, not acceptable. I'm sorry, you're a chemicals company. But, it's back to an awareness, so helping them with awareness, being patient, and actually having lines and saying it's not acceptable to say, look, but I just buy this soy. I don't know where it comes from. I just buy my photovoltaics from China. I have no responsibility. So I love what Alison was talking about. Like, Nestle is really embracing their role of, the influence that companies can have. Like companies need to use our influence more. Finance institutions, you need to use your influence more and say, this is not acceptable. Here's the Encore tool, by the way. And like this morning we had a really passionate plea. There is illegal logging and illegal gold mining happening in the Amazon, and ranches, etc. Like, this is not acceptable anymore, and it's not enough to say, I don't know. You need to find out, and it is possible. So maybe I'm just getting impatient. I'm still positive, but I'm getting impatient now because I'm not sure it's going fast enough, and all of us have a role to play in that. Thanks.
So a clear call to action, definitely. I already have one first question from the audience that is maybe of a bit of a technical nature and goes to you, Judson. Can you give an example of a nature metric for a bank?
Yeah, well, I mentioned these biodiversity footprints, and it's actually a regulatory requirement already in France for asset managers to try and disclose these across portfolios. So there's a lot of innovation going into trying to measure that. It's hard to get technical, but it sort of sums up to something called either a mean species abundance or a potentially disappeared fraction. And essentially it's trying to take a view on, sort of against a pristine state of nature, where are we today in terms of extant nature that's left or nature that has been lost, and sort of attach that based on essentially what companies are doing, what sectors are in, and then ideally, in an ideal world, although it doesn't work this way, but how they produce and where they do it. At the moment, all these metrics are working off of sort of sector averages, which obviously limits their informational value to some degree. But that's the kind of thing that is one approach. Is this single aggregate number. I guess the other your potential metrics that are out there are the ones that are, say, embedded a bit in some of the European regulations, the so-called principal adverse impact indicators under the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is really going a little bit more topic by topic, sort of water usage rates, pollution discharge rates and things like that. And so, again, you're supposed to be able to take those figures from companies and then potentially aggregate that across a portfolio and then you disclose it. Again, I think there's a challenge there about what's the right number? What is the right number for water usage, pollution discharge? I'm sure at some level people have some views, but clearly to put that into a portfolio as a whole, obviously creates some ability just to tweak portfolios to get a lower number, and is lower always better? Not necessarily, because it's about the engagement at the end of the day. In our view, as a large asset manager, we want to be engaging with companies to help them on their journey as a lender. We want to be working with the companies that we're lending to or helping take to the capital markets to improve on their own management and of nature-related risks. So it's not just about getting a lower number in the first instance. It really is about trying to work with and really demonstrate that improvement over time.
And I think someone who is already working with financial players on this is WWF. As far as I heard, they aim to come up with a first set of KPIs, hopefully in January next year, soon. And they are working with different financial players to develop such KPIs. A question that really goes to Alison about the threshold that TNFD uses to define where does your supply chain end. I think you probably had to do quite some thinking about where do you draw the line? How do you deal with it? And are there rules given from TNFD?
Well, yeah, that is a great question. I think that's something that is still being discussed within TNFD. I think referring back to Judson's chart where he was showing the disclosure recommendations as they've been published to date, that is still work in progress. I guess from a practical point of view, my working assumption is, from a Nestle perspective only, so this is not TNFD, is that I kind of think of it along the lines of scope 1, 2, and 3 for greenhouse gas, because one, everyone now understands that. Everyone's familiar with that terminology. So we're thinking, the nature part, it needs to be scope 3 as well. Because that's the part where we have the biggest dependency and we have the biggest impacts. So I think for us to make a difference and to really build resiliency in our supply chain and tackle climate change, it needs to be the entire value chain,
So you can't really stop anywhere. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think so. And I think you can't really, as I say, tackle your own climate-related risks and opportunities, and even nature-related risks and opportunities, if you're going to keep to scope 1 and 2. I'll use the greenhouse gas analogy. To me, it's not going to be possible, and probably not acceptable as well, I would think, from a financial point of view. But I don't know if you've got an opinion on that, Judson, in terms of from a financial point of view. You're going to want to understand the companies that you're investing in and lending to have a good understanding of their upstream impacts and dependencies, as well as downstream as well. For some sectors, it's going to be more driven by downstream as well.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. And to me, that's part and parcel of the idea of understanding impacts and dependencies, really, to get back upstream on your dependencies, get downstream on your impacts. And yeah, I think absolutely we would want you to understand that, and then at some level we need to understand it as well and form a view on how well we think you are doing with that. And so absolutely, I think that's got to be part of the equation.
Mm-hmm. In a previous panel, a data provider mentioned that they are currently not providing any data related to biodiversity. So how do investors deal with this now? Do you gather your data directly, or do you use tools like Encore? But maybe you seem to
I might come in here now again. So let's think of that theory of change we had a little bit with SBTN. So we've got the drivers, and then there's pressures, the 5 pressures. Remember them off by heart now, right? So land use change, resource use, climate change, pollution sources. invasive species, that's 5 of, and then those changes are driving changes in nature, which can be measured in the state of the ecosystem, the integrity of the ecosystem, the extent, and I've forgotten the other I, and then the threatened risk of those species. But all good theories of change is a line of accountability. A business is fully responsible for the pressures that they're creating in their value chain. They're not fully responsible for the state of nature in a watershed or the state of nature in a landscape, but they contribute to it. So the tricky thing is the contribution part, but what business can measure, and they're probably measuring already, is those pressures. And actually the second examples you were giving, Judson, earlier in terms of the metric, we're speaking to pollution. I think there was fresh water and there was another one in there. Like, they were the pressures. Mean species abundance can give you a sense of the risk. There's a potential risk in here, but then that's not the end of the story. It's like, what are you doing about that then? So Nespresso, as part of Nestlé, is a story I know well from my IUCN days. They looked at their coffee producers, 37,000 of them in Colombia. They had the data points for all of them. They knew about 10% of them were within or near protected areas. That's not the end of the story, just presence in protected area. So what? So we actually identified, we prioritized those, we engaged with them, we did an education, a training, awareness campaign, put in place certification schemes, so we are avoiding and reducing the negative impacts of those farmers, starting in the ones near and within protected areas, and then working our way out. The story then is the exchange you have. It's like, what risks look like? What are you doing about it? Are you managing that? You've got it under control? Fantastic. Are you measuring the pesticides that are going into that environment? Yep. Here's what it aggregates. So it's a story, but it's a logical story. That's what it means by to be strategically aligned. So you can understand your impacts, dependencies, where are the risks, the locations, then you put in place your actions, you reduce your pressures. Down the line, the government and civil society can measure the improved state of nature, but a business isn't fully responsible for that. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
Maybe a question that is related to it. I mean, we now talked about how is climate interrelated with biodiversity, but the question also around the social dimension. Is there a close link between preserving nature and creating social justice? Where do you see positive links, and are there any negative ones?
I mean, I think in order to transition to, a lower carbon supply chain, a more nature positive supply chain, this needs to be a just transition. It has to make sense socially and economically for our farmers. And we identify that within our regenerative agriculture, initiative to say that we have to work with our farmers. We can offer training and education, also our R&D technology, but also we need investment here as well. And to me, this is where the finance sector comes in as well. We do need investment to change to some of the methods, to invest in technologies. And then also the companies need to recognize, okay, we pay a premium for ingredients that are produced in a more environmentally sound way. So I think it has to go hand in hand, and that's very much our approach. It's not going to happen by itself, and if it doesn't make sense from an economic or social point of view, then that transition is going to be hard, if not impossible.
And as a bank, we had an environmental and social risk framework for many, many years. It goes back to the late 1990s, and it was environmental and social risk. To Allison's point, they do go hand in hand. They have their distinct points of emphasis and concerns, but in many ways, those two do get connected. Our frameworks now are called sustainability and climate risk, but it's still sustainability risk, the broader concept to bring both together.
Mm-hmm. A question that is related with the fact that you have to report to so many different frameworks. Is there a link between TNFD and the ISSB? Who knows about it? Maybe you, Alison?
Well, the TNFD has discussions with the ISSB. I mean, the ISSB at the moment are focused on climate, but clearly they'll develop other sustainability standards. So there's a close relationship between the chair of TNFD and the chair of ISSB. I think it's a great question. I think one of the things we want to see is a much more harmonized reporting framework. I think harmonized reporting framework will help everyone. It means that companies aren't spending their time trying to meet 30 different requirements and different sets of KPIs and different scopes. And I think it also helps from a comparability point of view for the financial sector industry as well, that it's clearer, more harmonized KPIs. And I also think, and maybe I'm with you, Judson, more simplified KPIs. Maybe it's not one number, but I think if we can develop pragmatic KPIs that helps to frame longer term targets on nature, to me that would be amazing. It would be an amazing step forward, because one thing, if we compare to climate, the greenhouse gas emission and the net zero roadmap has really helped to navigate and drive momentum, across sectors and across countries. And I think if we could have that for nature, and maybe it's 2 or 3 KPIs, but it's simple and it's understandable, so that when I mention scope 1, 2, and 3 and everyone understands me, we can be doing that in 2 years' time on nature. To me, that would be incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, before, Judson, in your speech, you mentioned how hopefully the biodiversity framework will also provide or lead to a goal that brings a point of orientation for you. The question here is, can TNFD then help both corporates from all sectors and financial institutions to align to such a goal? Do you think it's manageable? I think it goes in a similar direction. Will there be this one goal defined by a biodiversity convention that is useful for you as a point of orientation?
I'll defer to Nadine, but she's probably a little bit closer to the discussion. But I guess, the big picture concept of getting to, no net nature loss, net nature positive, nature restorative. I think that is a helpful framing just to focus people. Can you break that down into different components? The idea of protecting 30% of land and seas or other sort of terrestrial areas, for example. That may be helpful as well. And that also provides a bit of a benchmark you can start to think about scenarios on. If that really goes forward, and there are big portions of land and seas that are off limits, so to speak, or strictly managed, what does that mean to where companies are sourcing from? So I think potentially, we could have sort of the big picture target. Maybe it's not a number like 1.5, but at least a concept. Then maybe it gets broken down into different things that are a bit more tangible, actionable, that you can start to build off scenarios from. I think that could work, but I'll defer a bit to Nadine.
Yeah, so the Global Biodiversity Framework at the moment is covered in brackets everywhere, but the mission, there's really a broad alignment to halt and reverse the loss of, I think they say biodiversity, halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And so, we get this idea of bending the curve. I think there's a lot of unanimity around that. And as you say, it's quite a clear way of thinking about it. The next level down, as you say, the state level indicator, state of nature. So thinking about protected areas, thinking about species, extinction risk, etc., ecosystems. Again, that state of nature. Then there's a whole series of targets. And so I mentioned that super fast earlier on. But then the targets, what do they speak to? Pressures or impact drivers, depending on who you're speaking to. But there's a target on pollution. It focuses on plastics, pesticides, and herbicides to start with. There's a target on climate and the interface with climate and nature. There's a target on resource consumption. I'm missing another one. So then there's the targets which then speak to those pressures. And so again, keep that theory of change in your mind. There's a state of nature which has been affected by the pressures, and the Global Biodiversity Framework has that logical approach in there. And TNFD is also picking up on that pressures language. They just call it something else. But
I think what those targets would then let you start to think about are the scenarios. So what are the policy changes that are going to be needed to hit those targets by governments? How quickly will those come? And then that really starts to give you sort of the future vision of what may come. And then obviously you can start to assess, okay, what does it mean for a given sector, within sector, which companies are better positioned for that. So I think, the targets, those kinds of targets, I think will be quite impactful.
Mm-hmm. There's another question around technology. Which emerging technologies could help accelerate the adoption? I'm thinking that earlier this afternoon we hosted a session jointly with the Zurich University of Applied Science on artificial intelligence and big data solutions. You mentioned Encore. What tools are you using already, innovative technology tools, to address this complexity, and what do you see emerging out there?
Well, I'll let my panelists think about it. I want to come back to, what's your question? Well, if you're asking, what are my high-level potential material risks and opportunities, Encore is there for that. if my question is, how is the interventions that we're doing farmers on the ground, how is that helping to reduce pesticides going into nature, then you're going to need different tools for that. So you've really got to think, what's your question, who's asking that question, and where is the data going? I think the Science-Based Targets Network, we haven't spoken about much, but when they talk about setting science-based targets, you prioritize, you can use modeling data for that. There's a bit of a funnel, there's a level of granularity, so we can start with some modeling data, it's great to kind of help prioritize and zoom in. At a certain point, we need to get to locations. At a certain moment, you also then need real data from the ground. That's where there's real cool DNA stuff that's happening as well. But there's a granularity piece that's happening here. So sometimes modeling is fine. It's great. That helps you answer one question to prioritize. The closer you get to the ground and the more important that area is for people, for nature, for climate, then you're going to need more primary data. And then it comes back to all the tools. So it's more not what one tool can I use. It's not the one metric. It's not the one tool. What's your question? Who's asking? What information do they need at what level of granularity? And then there's a whole suite of tools out there. Yeah.
Any one of you wanting to comment on tools?
I mean, I think I'd probably echo what you said there. If we just take the greenhouse gas footprinting, when we first did the baseline work, a lot of it was dependent on secondary data. And we realised, country coefficients, crop coefficients, a lot of it, from Encourse. And you realise actually you've got to go much more local than that. So you want to collect primary data and how you do that for your farmers. So I'm not a technology expert, so I can't share with you the technologies you use, but exploring different ways to capture that primary data is key, and not just from a baseline point of view, but then trying to understand the interventions you're making, what type of impacts, positive or negative, they're having. So I think we're collecting a tremendous amount of data, so a lot more data, so a ton of big data, and how is that analysed and then modelled. So I agree with you, it depends on the type of data you're trying to collect. And I would say Encore, we use Encore, it's a very fantastic tool, I think, in trying to, at a very sort of global level, better understand your impacts and dependencies.
Yeah, maybe a question to finalize soon. I see that all our counterparts in companies are so busy just complying with the climate question. And now we come with biodiversity that in itself is a lot more complex. Are we asking too much, too fast? Or can we just bring these two together? Companies that already report based on TCFD, immediately starting to report on TNFD. How can we create synergies here?
Well, I can start. I think it's what our CEO at Nestle, Mark Schneider, says. Climate change is not going to wait for us. Nature loss is not going to wait for us. So we need to act. We need to take action, work out what's effective and scale up now. I think on reporting and disclosure, I think the questions that should be asked is, how will reporting, how will more disclosure drive action and create momentum? So I think that a principles-based approach to start with is important, because we don't have all the data we'd like. We don't necessarily have the accuracy we'd like, but I like the approach of TCFD, which was very principles-based. And I think also one of the key things that I think TCFD really helped to create was companies have for a long time reported out on the impacts we have on the environment and society, but think about how environment and society impacts back on us. So I think that sense of, nature is changing, nature loss is causing big risks and potential sort of systemic risks as well. How will that impact on you? So this concept of scenario thinking to me is very, very important. So I think what's important is keep it principles based and manageable, and that the companies report back out on what is material for them rather than 200 KPIs. But actually what is most pertinent for their business model, their sector.
Yeah, at some level, I'm not sure we have the luxury to not deal with the complexity. And it comes back to that planetary boundaries concept. There are just multiple physical limits we need to respect. And so somehow we need to manage against that set of your KPIs, and there are different topics. But what gives me hope, room for optimism, is just all the experience that's been gained on climate. I think that absolutely can be leveraged, and there's sort of, has been processes built up, understanding built up inside firms, new governance structures, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of good muscle memory there that can be deployed on the nature topic. But at some level, yeah, it's going to be something else. But I think that's just the reality of the situation that we face.
So definitely lots of challenges ahead, but also interesting solutions already at the horizon. Please join me in thanking the great panelists, Nadine, Alison and Judson, for the great insights you provided. And with that, we are close to coming to an end. Before really closing the sessions, I have two things to do. First, I would like to thank Building Bridges, its president, who is also our president, Patrick Audier, for making all of this possible, for providing the frame to have such important discussions. I would like to thank the team of SSF and of the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland for organizing this session. Of course, all the speakers. And now I have and thank you for joining the session and leading the dialogue with us. But now I have a very special guest to invite to the stage, and we feel honored that André Hoffmann is visiting us here to make yet another special announcement. I think you can speak here.
Well, there's nothing special about it at all. Thank you very much for everybody to have come here, and thank you very much for having to be aware of the fact that we need to sort of innovate. We are launching a new initiative today. We would like to explain to you what it is all about. It's called Innovate for Nature. Innovate means we haven't done it before. It's new, so we don't really quite sure how to do it, but we are going to use, in particular, the IUCN nature-based solution tool, which I think is included in the conversation we just had. We are going to explain that to you over a drink in 5 minutes next door in the foyer. You are all welcome. Please join us, and let's continue to talk about nature and how we can actually do something real and not just reporting, but using this technology to bring forward nature-based solution, and in particular, nature-positive investment. So if you have 5 minutes, please join us next door. We will give you more details and a glass of an excellent white wine. It's mine, so I know it's good.
Wonderful. With that, the session is closed, and we look forward to seeing you out there.